In the dark and dimly lit streets of medieval towns, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang out, mingling with the distant barking of dogs. Life in the Middle Ages was a stark contrast to the world we know today. It was a world where the gap between the rich and the poor was as vast as the chasm between the heavens and the earth. The lords and rulers, draped in fine silks and feasting on the finest foods, ruled over the poor and the peasants, who often struggled to survive another day. This is the story of a time when the cries of the oppressed were ignored, and the desperation of the poor boiled over into acts of rebellion and violence. Medieval theory taught that a ruler or lord should address any complaints of oppression by thoroughly investigating and making necessary reforms. The idea was that taxes should be fair, and not place an undue burden on the poor. However, this noble ideal was often nothing more than a dream. Philippe de Beaumanoir, a French jurist, wrote in the late 13th century that the poor, who were often subjected to harsh and unfair treatment, sometimes turned to violence because they could not find any other way to obtain justice. They formed associations or groups to refuse to work for low wages and to punish those who did not join them. Beaumanoir saw this as a grave threat to the common good, arguing that work must continue for the benefit of society. He believed that those who led such movements should be harshly punished, with long prison sentences and heavy fines. The most persistent unrest was among the weavers and cloth workers of Flanders, a region that experienced rapid economic growth during the Middle Ages. The textile industry was booming, much like the automobile industry would be centuries later. However, this economic expansion also brought deep divisions. The guilds, which were once a community of masters, journeymen, and apprentices, were now dominated by wealthy entrepreneurs who had little concern for the well-being of their workers. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, and class hatred became a defining feature of society. In the cities of Flanders, the wealthy magnates, who often married into noble families and owned both city and rural properties, formed a powerful patrician class. They controlled the local governments, founding churches, hospitals, and impressive buildings like the cloth halls. However, they also imposed heavy taxes on essential goods, which fell heavily on the poor. The poor, often referred to as blue nails because of their dirty fingernails, had no political rights and were vulnerable to unemployment and mistreatment. Despite the harsh conditions, medieval life was also marked by a sense of community. People lived in close-knit groups, orders, associations, and brotherhoods. These groups provided a sense of belonging and support, especially in times of need. For example, the confréries or brotherhoods were associations of people from the same trade or village. They would support a member who was sick, help with funeral costs, and even search for a missing person. These groups also organized religious plays, competitions, and social events, making life more bearable for those who might otherwise have felt alone. However, the tensions between the rich and the poor continued to simmer. In 1320, the rural poor, who had been hit hard by a series of famines, erupted into a mass movement known as the Pastoureaux. Led by shepherds, this movement quickly spread among the peasants and the poor, who were already struggling against the oppression of the landowners. They stormed castles and abbeys, burned town halls, and freed prisoners. The movement also turned violent, leading to the slaughter of Jews and lepers, who were seen as scapegoats for the people's suffering. The Pastoureaux movement was a wake-up call for the ruling class, who realized that the poor could turn against them if pushed too far. The Church, which had a significant influence on medieval society, also warned the rich of the dangers of oppressing the poor. Jacques de Vitry, a 13th century writer, spoke out against the nobles, comparing them to ravenous wolves who lived off the blood and sweat of the poor. He warned that the poor, if pushed to the brink, could rise up and cause great harm. The poor and the peasants, who were often denied basic rights, found ways to resist. They refused to work for the lords, disposed of their land without permission, and even joined together to assault the bailiffs who represented the lords. This resistance was not without consequences, as they faced fines and punishment, but their determination to assert their rights persisted. In the midst of these tensions, the state struggled to finance its growing needs. Centralized government was developing, but the concept of taxation was still seen as an emergency measure that required the consent of the people. King Philip the Fair of France, facing financial difficulties, turned to the Knights Templar, a powerful and wealthy monastic order, in a shocking and infamous move. The Templars, who had been formed during the Crusades to protect Christian pilgrims and defend the Holy Land, had grown into a powerful and wealthy organization. They were tax-exempt and had amassed significant wealth as bankers and moneylenders. Philip, in a sudden and brutal move, arrested every Templar in France on charges of heresy, using accusations of witchcraft and devil worship to justify his actions. The Templars were subjected to horrific tortures, including being racked, starved, and burned, to extract confessions. Many died under the torture, and those who confessed were later burned at the stake. The trials of the Templars, which lasted for 7 years, were a dark chapter in medieval history, and they set a dangerous precedent for using charges of witchcraft and heresy to persecute enemies. The fall of the Templars was a turning point, and it had far-reaching consequences. The use of torture to extract confessions became more common, and the Inquisition, which was already active in persecuting heretics, used these methods to target more people. The legend of the Templars' curse, which claimed that the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, cursed Philip and the Pope from the pyre, added a supernatural element to the story. Both Philip and the Pope died within a year of the execution, fueling the belief in the curse. In conclusion, the Middle Ages were a time of great contrasts and contradictions. While there were moments of community and support, the deep-seated tensions between the rich and the poor often led to violence and rebellion. The story of the Templars and the Pastoureaux movement are stark reminders of the dangers of oppression and the lengths to which people will go to seek justice. These events left a lasting impact on medieval society and shaped the course of history in ways that are still felt today.